exile and kill him? Why did they just kick him out?
There's some really interesting stuff. I mean, people have been arguing about this since before he was killed. No, I mean, really. That was a neat book by a newspaper writer who died after deciding he was going to retire and learn Greek and then translate or write all about, the Greeks. And he got as far as writing the Apology of Socrates or the Trial of Socrates, and then died. But that book was really, I.F. Stone was the author, and he wrote the Trial of Socrates. And there's other things going on. And part of it is the history of Athens had been at war with Sparta and lost. And as a result of that, the democracy of Athens, which, by the way, wasn't a democracy in the sense that every citizen had a vote. There were roughly only about 500 or so, I guess, who had property and could be voting, right? And so it's not everybody, there were a lot of slaves,
Foreign workers,
wives.
They were their own class, I believe.
Medics.
So there were a lot of people living there that didn't have citizenship in that same sense. In fact, one of the greatest in that particular time was Perseus, Pericles. Okay, Pericles had a spouse that was not a Greek citizen, an Athenian citizen, and he had a child by her, and because of their law, that child couldn't inherit dad's stuff, and so that pissed him off because of the strict laws in any case. So even some of their heroes couldn't change that situation. But we think of it as an important democracy because of that was one type of government. There were actually lots of different ones in the Greek, polises all over. So I'm trying to remember now what your question was initially.
Why wasn't he ostracized instead of?
Yeah, well, according to I.F. Stone, the problem was he was associated with when the Spartans won, they put an authority on top of everybody called the 30.
The 30 tyrants.
30 tyrants, and they were going to get rid of all the Democrats. And so they sent hit teams out to go kill them, and one of them, Socrates, was supposed to lead the hit team to that person, and he refused to do it. And anybody that refused to go along with the tyrants was usually killed themselves. Well, that works. But in this particular case, the tyrants didn't kill Socrates, so that made everybody think, he must have been in league with them, right? So when they overthrew the tyrants and took the democracy, put the democracy back into place, he was suspicious of one of the ones that were on the tyrants that they were getting rid of.
A collaborator.
Yes.
They didn't want to kick him out so he could just go back to his friends.
Plato's in this group too, by the way, because Plato is an aristocrat, and the aristocrats are associated with this tyrant group, right? So Plato flees himself. He's one of Socrates' students. He's also in the trial, because Plato, he's mentioned as one of the ones. Check with him, see if I've done any of this stuff, right? And so Plato flees and spends time away, and then comes back and starts his own school. By the way, we're reading Plato. Socrates apparently didn't write. It's not like he even sat down in the sand and started to write the sins, Ye who have no sin, cast the first stone. That kind of writing, He didn't even do that, as far as we know. In fact, he was against writing. But Plato is the one who gives us these Socratic dialogues. Now here's an interesting thing. The character of Socrates seems to be this kind of asshole that bothers everybody. That really seems to be what Socrates was. You know, asking these questions, people think they know the answer to them. We get into it and we discover, no, it doesn't, right? And that pisses everybody off at him, right? Why didn't he leave? He liked doing this. He thought this was really important, right? And he thought he might be able to find out what the answers were. As it turns out, Plato, who's a student of his, roughly 20-something, when Socrates is killed, ends up becoming now a teacher himself and founds a school on a piece of property in Athens called the Academy, right? It was called that because a man donated the field to Athens on his death, and his name was Academus, and so this is the academy, right? And so that's where the word academy comes from, right? But in any case, Plato starts a school there, and we end up with Platonic dialogues. 3 different periods, they believe. That's the tradition, right? The first set of dialogues, the early dialogues, describe Socrates as this asshole that asks these kinds of questions and gets everybody furious. Can I use the word asshole? Is that all right? Everyone, I think, is familiar with it. Okay. So you get the idea, right? Pisses everybody off, right? All of a sudden, though, the dialogues change, and Socrates becomes a different kind of. He now knows everything. And so everybody, in a very boring way, says, so what is this, Socrates? And Socrates tells them. He says, wow, that's tremendous, Socrates. What is this? And he tells them, and they go, wow, Socrates, that's really great. And he just keeps doing that through hundreds of pages. And what happened? Did Socrates suddenly start knowing everything? No. Plato thinks he knows everything. And he's still writing dialogues using Socrates as one of the disputants in most of the dialogues, right? Lots of others. Some of them, like the Republic, there's lots of different individuals in the dialogue. Some of the, like Symposium, lots of different people. But Socrates is in there and, very much a part of the discussion. But the second period of dialogues, you get Platonic philosophy, which we call idealism. These are all ideas. We're trying to figure out what the idea means. What is it, right? And Plato figures it out. So as we're moving on, we're going to see what idealism is, right? Sorry if that's boring, but it'll be fun. You'll see. And then we get to the third period, and now we've got Aristotle as Plato's student. And Aristotle is a book nerd. He actually really does know stuff. In fact, he's going to be the one who invents how you know stuff. Really, right? And the way that we still use it. He invents true and false, for example, right? And knowing things is knowing what's true and knowing what's false, right? That's what we think of today. By the way, I read lots of Americans writing lots of things, calling people names because they're liars. And I've talked with lawyers, some really good friends, and they all agree that in order to lie, you have to know what's true and then deliberately tell a falsehood instead of what's true. And a lot of people are calling individuals liars that don't know that they're wrong for what they say. So it's actually inappropriate to refer to them as liars. They're just wrong. Or at least you don't agree with what they think, which means you don't know what's right and they don't know what's right. We don't know what's right, but I totally disagree with what you think. But you can't call them a liar just because of that. Because they're not lying if they don't know that something is true. Now, of course, the same people might actually know something, so they still might be liars in other cases. So I'm not saying you can't call them liars. But so Plato is going to get involved with Aristotle, and then Aristotle's going to clearly be asking questions of Plato. And so the third period of dialogues, the Platonic dialogues, are problematic, like the Parmenides. One of the individuals that Zeno was a follower of Parmenides. Paramenides. Para means two. Mena is unchanging ideas, right? Paramenides, right? So you've got two unchanging ideas, and these ideas are in conflict. So, for example, for Parmenides, everything is one. The universe is all one. What is the universe? It's one thing. And since it's one thing, it can't have parts, because otherwise it's not one thing. So there can be no parts. It's kind of, when I think of it, you know, that little game where you have like the little letters on squares and you move them around because there's an empty square. You can move them around and do things. Imagine there's no empty square. That game would really suck, right? Right? You get the idea, right? Parmenides, you know, everything is one. There can be no motion. It's an illusion. And Zeno, his follower, kind of points this out with the paradoxes. How many have heard of Zeno's paradoxes? Okay, so there's bunches of them, at least 3, but basically they're all the same. We can do it this way. Well, that looks too complex. Oh, here we go. So basically, the problem is concerned with the nature of the infinite. So if I'm shooting an arrow, or in this case, I guess this is Achilles racing the tortoise, right? And the Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. But then every moment after that, Achilles closes the distance between him and the tortoise, closes the distance, closes the distance. But he can never actually completely close the distance because there's always a slight amount of distance between him and the tortoise. Problem with the infinite, right? If I shoot an arrow at point B, right, before the arrow gets from A to B, it has to go half the distance. Before it goes half the distance, it has to go half that distance, half that distance, half that distance. Eventually you get to realize, well, there's theoretically no way the arrow could get to the target. Motion is impossible mathematically. As far as I know, mathematics hasn't really solved this problem.
I think there's a number file video where they did, and I think it was either Newton or someone else.
Aristotle came up with a solution, but no one is really completely in agreement with Aristotle. What he says is the problem is you're talking about two different types of distance. The one and the other. So for example, if I'm trying to shoot an arrow and I think I can't possibly get the arrow to move, I'm thinking in space there has to be an impossible distance between here and there. But at the same time, I'm thinking time is limited. So I'm using a finite conception of time to cover an infinite distance. As a result, I can never get it. If, on the other hand, says Aristotle, you use a finite conception of space, then obviously I can get there in a finite amount of time. And it's unfair if I say it's an infinite distance and a finite amount of time. Well, use an infinite amount of time and you'll get there infinitely, eventually, right? So that's Aristotle's solution. But I've never met anyone that was happy with that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So is this a paradox with like Zeno's idea of everything being one, or is this something different?
He was a follower of him, but it is somewhat different from Parmenides.
Okay.
But Parmenides is also a dialogue of Plato. There's no possibility that they actually ever met, I don't think. Although in the dialogue they apparently do. But the time difference is quite different. But in any case, so the dialogues are not considered to be actual factual recordings of a debate